She found proof, called the reporter, got in her car, but never arrived.
And the files she was carrying?
Gone.
There is a specific kind of silence that exists on rural Oklahoma roads after midnight. Not peaceful silence, not the silence of a sleeping town or a quiet neighborhood. This is the silence of distance, the kind that swallows sound whole, where a car can travel for miles without passing another living soul, where the only marker of your existence in the dark is the cone of your own headlights cutting forward into nothing. On the night of November 13th, 1974, a white Honda Civic moved through that silence. The driver had been on this road before. She knew its long, flat stretches, its gentle curves, the way the darkness seemed to lean in closer the further you got from the lights of Crescent, Oklahoma. She had driven this particular 30-mile route between the Kerr-McGee plutonium fuel rod plant and the city of Oklahoma City dozens of times. She knew the road. Inside that small car, on the passenger seat beside her, was a manila folder, documents, handwritten notes, evidence, or what she believed was evidence, of something that had been happening inside that plant for months. Evidence of contamination, of falsified quality control records, of workers being exposed to radioactive materials without their knowledge or consent. Evidence she had gathered carefully, piece by piece, while continuing to show up to her shift every day, while continuing to smile at supervisors who she believed were lying to federal investigators, while carrying inside her chest the specific weight of a person who knows something that powerful people do not want known. She was driving to meet a reporter from the New York Times. His name was David Burnham. He had been working on the story. She had called him earlier that evening. She told him she had documents. She never arrived. Her car was found at the bottom of a concrete embankment off the left side of the highway, the front end crumpled against a culvert wing wall. The manila folder, the documents, the handwritten notes, they were not found at the scene. In the days and months and years that followed, no one in any position of authority could fully explain where they went. Her name was Karen Silkwood. She was 28 years old. And what happened to her on that dark Oklahoma road is a question that has never, in more than 5 decades, received a complete and honest answer. To understand what Karen Silkwood was willing to risk, you first have to understand who she was before she became a symbol. She grew up in Longview, Texas, in the 1950s and early 1960s, a time when that part of the country moved at a particular rhythm. Church on Sundays, Friday night football, mothers who kept immaculate kitchens, and fathers who came home from work at the same time every evening. Karen fit into that world, and she didn't, simultaneously. She was sharp, she was curious. She asked questions that sometimes made adults uncomfortable, not because she was trying to provoke anyone, but because she genuinely wanted to know the answer. She was a good student, particularly in the sciences. She enrolled at Lamar College of Technology in Beaumont, with the intention of becoming a medical technologist. This was 1964, the year the Civil Rights Act passed, the year the Beatles landed in America, the year a young woman with an aptitude for chemistry and a desire to do something meaningful with her life could look at the country around her and believe, reasonably, that the world was moving toward something better. She did not finish college. She married a man named William Meadows, had 3 children in relatively quick succession, and by the early 1970s, the marriage had ended. This is the part of Karen's story that the cleaner versions tend to skip past. That she was a young divorced mother who had given her children to the custody of their father because she could not, on her own, provide the kind of stable home they needed. That was not an easy decision. It was not made without grief. And it shaped, in ways that are not difficult to understand, the particular intensity with which she threw herself into her work and her cause. She moved to Crescent, Oklahoma, and took a job at the Kerr-McGee Cimarron fuel fabrication site in 1972. The plant manufactured plutonium fuel pellets for experimental nuclear reactors. The work was specialized, technical, and, as Karen and her co-workers were repeatedly assured by plant management, perfectly safe when proper protocols were followed. She joined the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. She became a union representative, which tells you something. People who become union representatives in industrial plants are not generally the quiet ones. They are the people who feel things strongly, who believe that the arrangement between a company and the people who work for that company should be honest and fair, and who are willing to stand up in a room full of people and say so out loud when it isn't. She had a boyfriend, a union colleague named Drew Stevens. She had close friends. She laughed easily. She liked to listen to music. The early 1970s gave her plenty to choose from. The Eagles had just released their first album. Carole King's Tapestry was on every radio in America. There was something in that era's music, something searching and personal and unafraid of complicated emotion that matched her own interior life. In the spring of 1974, she attended a union bargaining session in Washington, D.C. It was there, listening to other workers describe conditions at their facilities, the casual dismissal of safety concerns, the pressure to keep production moving, the way management language could make dangerous things sound routine, that something shifted in Karen Silkwood. She came back to Oklahoma with different eyes. She began to pay closer attention to what was happening inside the plant. She began to take notes. The last documented quote from her that survives from a relaxed personal moment before the investigation, before the fear, comes from a co-worker who remembered her laughing in the break room sometime in early 1974, saying she was going to make sure somebody paid attention to what was going on in that place. She meant it. She had no idea what paying attention was going to cost her. November 13, 1974 was a Wednesday. Richard Nixon had resigned the presidency just 3 months earlier. Gerald Ford was in the White House, having just issued the pardon that would define his presidency and divide the country. The Vietnam War was grinding toward its end. America was tired in a particular way, tired of being lied to, tired of discovering that the institutions it had built its trust upon had been operating according to their own private rules. Karen Silkwood was already tired too, but for different reasons. She had spent the previous weeks under a strain that few people in her life fully understood. In September of 1974, she had presented union officials with a verbal account of what she believed was happening at the plant. Contaminated workers, falsified records, quality control documentation that did not reflect what was actually being produced. The union had taken it seriously enough to pass her concerns upward to the Atomic Energy Commission, the federal body responsible for regulating nuclear facilities. An AEC inspection followed. But Karen had told union officials something that the official inspection could not address. She believed that some of the documentation she had seen had been deliberately altered, not just incomplete, altered. Someone, she believed, was changing records after the fact. She had been gathering evidence. Then something happened that changed everything. In the first week of November 1974, Karen Silkwood was found to be contaminated with plutonium, not just at trace levels detected at the plant, contaminated in her apartment, in her refrigerator, in the bologna in her refrigerator, in her urine samples. The level of contamination discovered in her body and her home was severe enough that the AEC sent a health physics team to her apartment to scrub it down, bagging her belongings as hazardous waste. How the plutonium got there was never definitively established. Kerr-McGee suggested in language that reads today as deliberate and calculated that Karen had contaminated herself, that she had brought plutonium home intentionally, either as a stunt or as an act of sabotage. They offered no coherent explanation for why a woman would poison herself with a radioactive substance. They simply introduced the possibility into the air, where it drifted and settled like smoke. Karen's own belief, told to friends, to union officials, to the reporter at the Times, was that someone had contaminated her deliberately, to discredit her, to make her testimony about worker safety appear to come from an unstable person with a motive to lie. On November 13th, she attended a union meeting at the Hub Cafe in Crescent. This is documented. Witnesses remember her there. She was, by multiple accounts, holding a manila folder. She seemed focused. Some witnesses said she seemed nervous, others said she seemed purposeful. There's a difference, and people who knew Karen could read it. The meeting ended. She got in her car. She had spoken with David Burnham of the Times earlier that day, confirming she was on her way. She turned onto Highway 74 and drove south toward Oklahoma City. The weather that night was cold. The road was dry. There was no rain, no ice, no fog. Visibility was not a factor. The road itself is not technically difficult. It runs through flat land with gentle curves, the kind of driving a person can do while thinking about something else, which Karen certainly was. Somewhere between the Hub Cafe and Oklahoma City, the white Honda Civic left the left side of the road. It traveled approximately 240 feet off the road surface before hitting a concrete culvert wing wall. The impact crumpled the front of the car. Karen Silkwood died from injuries sustained in the crash. The manila folder was not found. The documents were not found. The handwritten notes were not found. That is where the facts end and the questions begin. And they have never stopped. The call came in around midnight. A passing motorist had spotted the crumpled Honda at the bottom of the culvert and stopped to check. By the time the first Oklahoma Highway Patrol officer arrived, Karen Silkwood was already dead. The initial investigation treated this as a traffic fatality. This was not unusual. On rural Oklahoma highways in 1974, single car accidents happened. The Highway Patrol officer noted the time, the location, the condition of the vehicle, the condition of the road. He noted that there were no skid marks. A driver who falls asleep or loses consciousness does not brake. That was a possible explanation. She had attended a union meeting. She had been under significant stress. Perhaps she had fallen asleep at the wheel. The toxicology report complicated this. It showed the presence of methaqualone, the sedative commonly known by the brand name Quaalude, in Karen's system. The Highway Patrol noted this as consistent with someone who might have lost consciousness while driving. Case, by their assessment, essentially explained. But the people who knew Karen Silkwood were not satisfied, and their dissatisfaction was not the automatic denial of grief, though grief was certainly present. There were specific things that did not fit. The union officials who had been working with Karen immediately noticed the absence of the documents. Karen had told multiple people she was bringing documentation to the Times. Where was it? The crash scene was processed for evidence, but no one, at any point in the initial investigation, appeared to be looking for documents related to nuclear plant safety violations. The Highway Patrol was investigating an accident. They were not investigating a whistleblower. Karen's father, Bill Silkwood, arrived in Oklahoma with a question that no official could answer cleanly. If his daughter had fallen asleep at the wheel on a flat, dry road, why did the car show a dent on the rear bumper consistent with being struck from behind? The Highway Patrol's position was that the dent was old damage unrelated to the crash. Bill Silkwood did not believe this. He would spend years not believing it. The union hired its own accident reconstruction specialist, a man named A.O. Pipkin, an experienced analyst from Dallas. Pipkin's conclusion, after examining the physical evidence, was that the damage to the rear bumper of the Honda was consistent with the vehicle making contact with the car from behind, possibly forcing it off the road. The paint transfer on the rear bumper came from a vehicle that was not the Honda itself. The Highway Patrol disputed this. The official position remained: single car accident, driver possibly impaired by sedatives. What happened in the weeks after Karen's death established a pattern that her family and union supporters would struggle against for years. Every question they raised was met with an institutional response that explained away the concern without fully addressing it. The documents were not found, but that was perhaps because there were no documents of the significance Karen had claimed. The bumper damage was old. The methaqualone was consistent with accidental impairment. The manner of death was accidental. Each individual explanation was possible. Together, they created a picture so clean, so efficiently wrapped, that the people who loved Karen Silkwood found themselves in the exhausting position of grieving not just a person, but the deliberate erasure of that person's purpose. Her union filed for an investigation. The AEC was notified. Slowly, the case began to attract national attention, the kind that comes not from official channels acknowledging wrongdoing, but from journalists who noticed that the official explanations had too many convenient edges. David Burnham of the Times published his story. He had no documents because the documents had not arrived, but he had Karen's verbal accounts, her union's records, and a death that raised more questions than the highway patrol seemed interested in asking. America, in November 1974, was not in the mood to trust official explanations. It had just watched a president resign. It was not difficult, in that climate, for people to believe that institutions might cover things up. The search for what Karen Silkwood had actually found and what had actually happened to her was beginning. It would not be quick. Here is what most accounts of the Karen Silkwood case focus on: the accident, the missing documents, the debate about whether she was run off the road. These are the dramatic elements. They are also, in a sense, the surface. What lies underneath, what the most significant legal proceedings in this case established, and what tends to get lost in the retelling, is a documented history of plutonium contamination at the Kerr-McGee Cimarron facility that predates Karen Silkwood's death by months and exists entirely independent of whether she was murdered or not. Between 1970 and 1974, the Kerr-McGee plant had experienced a series of contamination incidents that, taken together, describe not a series of accidents but a systemic failure of the safety culture that nuclear processing requires. Workers were contaminated and sent home. Contaminated protective gear was found in areas it should never have reached. The plant's quality control documentation, which was required by the AEC to meet specific standards because these fuel rods were intended for experimental nuclear reactors and the consequences of defective fuel were potentially catastrophic, was not consistently accurate. This is the detail that tends to get overlooked in the focus on Karen's death. She was not just a worker who had been contaminated and was angry about it. She was a quality control analyst who had access to specific production records, and what she told union officials and the Times reporter was that she had seen those records change, not be updated, not be corrected. Change in ways that made defective fuel rods appear to meet safety standards they did not actually meet. If this was true, the implications extended well beyond one woman's contamination and one company's workplace safety violations. It meant that nuclear fuel that did not meet safety specifications was potentially being shipped to a facility where it would be used in an experimental reactor. The danger was not hypothetical. It was physical, measurable, and, if Karen's account was accurate, it was being actively concealed. The AEC's own inspections in the fall of 1974, which Karen had helped to prompt, found a facility with significant compliance issues. The agency had issued citations. But the AEC, it is important to understand, was at this time both the promoter and the regulator of nuclear power in America, a structural conflict of interest so profound that Congress would eventually recognize it and split the agency into two separate bodies. The AEC had a financial and ideological stake in nuclear energy succeeding, which meant it also had a stake in not finding things that would generate public alarm about nuclear safety. Karen Silkwood was a complication. A contaminated, outspoken, union-active quality control analyst who was about to hand documented evidence to a major newspaper was a very specific kind of complication for a regulatory agency trying to maintain public confidence in an industry it both oversaw and championed. There's a thread in the legal history of this case that has received almost no attention in popular accounts, and it matters. In 1976, Karen's estate, represented by attorney Gerald Spence, who would become one of the most celebrated trial lawyers in American history, filed a civil lawsuit against Kerr-McGee. The lawsuit did not primarily concern the car crash. It concerned the contamination. It argued that the plutonium found in Karen's body and her home came from the Kerr-McGee plant through the company's negligence, and that the contamination itself, regardless of what happened afterward on Highway 74, constituted harm for which the company bore responsibility. What emerged during the discovery process for that lawsuit was something that had never been publicly examined before: the internal communication records of Kerr-McGee's management regarding worker contamination events. These documents showed that management was aware of contamination problems significantly before they were reported to regulators. They showed a pattern of delay between when contamination events occurred and when they were formally logged. They showed a company that understood its regulatory obligations and managed the timing of its disclosures strategically. None of this proved that Karen was murdered, but it established, through the company's own internal records, that the culture of concealment she had described to union officials was not imagined. It was real, it was documented, and it had been operating for years before Karen Silkwood decided to do something about it. The 1979 trial produced a jury verdict that awarded Karen's estate $10 million in punitive damages from Kerr-McGee, a finding that explicitly held the company responsible for the contamination that harmed her. On appeal, this was reduced and eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, with Kerr-McGee admitting no wrongdoing. The legal system had, in its characteristically incomplete way, confirmed that something wrong had happened, while stopping carefully short of saying exactly what. The question that this hidden layer forces us to ask is not simply whether Karen Silkwood was murdered on a dark Oklahoma highway. It is this: even if she had arrived safely in Oklahoma City that night, even if she had handed every document to David Burnham, even if the story had run in the Times the following morning, would it have been enough? Would the institutions responsible for preventing exactly this kind of harm have acted with the urgency that harm demanded, based on their track record before November 13, 1974? That answer is uncomfortable. The world did not stop for Karen Silkwood. This is one of the cruelties of cases like hers: the way the larger current of events keeps moving while the people left behind stand still, frozen at the moment of loss, trying to make sense of something that resists sense. Gerald Ford gave way to Jimmy Carter, who gave way to Ronald Reagan. The 1970s became the 1980s. The nuclear industry that Karen had tried to hold accountable went through its own reckoning at 3 Mile Island in 1979, and the public fear that followed that accident gave the issues Karen had raised a new and terrible relevance, even as her name receded from the front pages. Her father, Bill Silkwood, did not recede. He drove back to Texas from Oklahoma, having buried his daughter with a question he could not set down. What happened on that road? He gave interviews, he spoke to journalists, he sat with attorneys. He was not a prominent man, not a powerful one. He was a sheet metal worker from Nederland, Texas. But he possessed the particular stubbornness of a father who has been given an explanation he does not believe and refuses to pretend otherwise. The union, the oil, chemical, and atomic workers continued to push for a criminal investigation into the crash. The FBI eventually took a limited look and concluded there was insufficient evidence to pursue federal charges. This was not a dramatic clearing of the record. It was not a thorough investigation. It was an institutional determination that the available evidence did not rise to the level required to proceed, which is a very different thing from a finding that nothing wrong had occurred. Karen's friends carried her differently. Drew Stevens, her boyfriend, who had been the last person to speak with her before she drove to that union meeting, spent years giving accounts of that evening, what she said, how she sounded, what she told him about the documents she was carrying. His testimony was consistent across decades. He never wavered in his belief about what happened. In 1983, Hollywood produced a film about Karen's life and death. Silkwood, directed by Mike Nichols and starring Meryl Streep, brought the case back into national conversation. Streep's portrayal was neither saint nor symbol. It was a specific human being with a messy apartment and a complicated personal life, and a stubborn, growing conviction that something was wrong and that she was the person who had to do something about it. The film did not answer the question of what happened on the highway. It wasn't trying to. It was trying to make audiences understand who Karen Silkwood was before the question consumed her. The response was significant. Audiences who had been teenagers during the original events were now adults in their 30s. They came to the film with the cultural memory of Watergate and Vietnam, and a general sense that their government and the corporations it partnered with did not always tell the truth. The film did not have to persuade them that cover-ups were possible. It only had to show them the human cost of one. What the years of silence did to the Silkwood family was this. It replaced the specific, sharp grief of sudden loss with something duller and more persistent, the grief of permanent uncertainty. Bill Silkwood could mourn his daughter. He could not resolve her death. He could not place it in a narrative that made sense, could not tell his grandchildren that their grandmother died because of X and justice was served in the form of Y. He could only tell them that she died and that something about it was wrong, and that the people responsible for finding out what had never fully done their jobs. This is what prolonged institutional failure actually looks like in a family. Not dramatic, not loud, just the quiet, permanent weight of an unresolved story living in the space where an answer should be. The most significant development in the legal history of the Karen Silkwood case came not from a criminal investigation, not from a deathbed confession, not from a newly discovered witness. It came from a federal courtroom in Oklahoma City in 1979, and it arrived in a form that was both more and less satisfying than the public had hoped for. The civil trial, Karen Silkwood's estate versus Kerr McGee Corporation, lasted several weeks. Gerald Spence, the Wyoming attorney who had taken the case, conducted a methodical and often devastating examination of the company's internal practices. He was not a quiet lawyer. He wore Western boots and fringed jackets and spoke to juries as if he were talking to neighbors over a fence, which made his arguments more rather than less effective because they were grounded in specificity and plain language. Spence did not need to prove that Karen had been murdered. He needed to prove that Kerr McGee's negligence had resulted in her contamination, and that this contamination was a harm for which the company bore responsibility. He proved it. The jury, after deliberation, awarded Karen's estate $505,000 in actual damages and $10 million in punitive damages. $10 million was, in 1979, an extraordinary sum, a signal that the jury had heard enough about Kerr McGee's safety practices to conclude that punishment, not just compensation, was warranted. The reaction in the courtroom was not triumphant. People who have waited years for any form of accountability tend not to celebrate it loudly. Karen's father sat quietly. He had what he had come for: a formal legal acknowledgement that the company that had contaminated his daughter had done so through negligence, and that this negligence was serious enough to warrant punitive consequences. But the victory was complicated almost immediately. Kerr McGee appealed. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals reduced the punitive damages on grounds related to the legal standard applicable in nuclear contamination cases, specifically the question of whether the Price-Anderson Act, the federal law governing nuclear liability, preempted state law punitive damages. This was a technical legal argument with profound practical consequences. It meant that the punishment the jury had wanted to impose was constrained by the very federal framework that was supposed to protect the public from exactly this kind of corporate behavior. The case eventually settled out of court. The terms were not disclosed. Kerr McGee made no admission of wrongdoing. This is the breakthrough the Silkwood family received after 5 years of litigation, financial settlement, no admission of fault, and the question of what happened on Highway 74 still unanswered. This is how the legal system often resolves cases that touch on institutional power, not with clarity, but with a transaction that permits all parties to stop fighting without requiring any of them to tell the complete truth. The FBI investigation into the crash itself, whether Karen had been forced off the road, was eventually reopened in the early 1980s following congressional pressure. Investigators re-examined the physical evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and consulted additional accident reconstruction specialists. Their conclusion was the same as the original highway patrol finding. The evidence was insufficient to establish that a second vehicle had been involved. They noted the rear bumper damage, but could not definitively link it to the crash itself. Insufficient evidence is not the same as it didn't happen. People in Karen Silkwood's circle understood this distinction clearly. They had been living inside it for years. What the investigations did produce, almost inadvertently, was a broader public and congressional reckoning with the AEC's inherent conflict of interest. The Atomic Energy Commission, which had both promoted and regulated nuclear power, was abolished by the Energy Reorganization Act of 1974, the very year Karen Silkwood died. It was replaced by two separate bodies, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, focused on safety oversight, and the Energy Research and Development Administration, focused on promotion. This structural reform did not come because of Karen Silkwood alone, but her case and the contamination events at Kerr-McGee that her investigation had brought to light were part of the documented record that demonstrated why the arrangement had been a failure. An institution was reformed. It was not enough, but it was something. What Karen Silkwood's death took from her family was not reducible to the loss of one person, though that loss alone was immeasurable. It took the particular future she would have built. She was 28 years old. She had 3 children she was working toward, being able to support and be present for again. She was at the beginning of something, not at the end of anything. The version of Karen Silkwood who had become a union activist, who had taught herself to pay close attention, who had decided that the gap between what Kerr-McGee was telling its workers and what was actually happening deserved to be closed, that Karen was not yet finished becoming whoever she would have been. Her children grew up knowing their mother as a story before they could fully know her as a person. This is one of the specific cruelties reserved for families of people who die young and publicly. The story of Karen Silkwood, the symbol, the case, the film, the legal history, was available to them in ways that their actual mother was not. They could read about her. They could watch Meryl Streep embody a version of her. They could not call her. They could not show her who they had become. Bill Silkwood carried his question about what happened on Highway 74 for the rest of his life. He gave his last public interview on the subject when he was elderly, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man who has rehearsed an argument so many times that it has become part of his breathing. He believed his daughter had been murdered. He did not believe the official account. He did not pretend otherwise, and he did not apologize for refusing to pretend. Drew Stevens, the man who had spoken with Karen hours before her death, carried something different, the specific weight of having been the last voice she heard, having told her to be careful, having heard her say she would be fine. This is the kind of memory that does not resolve. It simply continues, carried forward year after year, present in every recounting. What the experience of advocating for Karen Silkwood took from the people who loved her was the ordinary texture of moving on. Grief is supposed to move, not disappear, not be forgotten, but transform over time into something that can coexist with living. When grief is compounded by an unresolved question, by institutional denial, by the suspicion that truth was deliberately buried, it does not transform. It calcifies. It becomes a permanent posture of watchfulness and dissatisfaction, because to relax that posture feels like abandoning the person who deserved better. This is what Karen Silkwood's family and friends were left with, not just loss, but the permanent effort of refusing to let that loss be settled on terms they had not agreed to. That effort is its own kind of tribute. It is also its own kind of suffering. There is a particular kind of American story that Karen Silkwood's case belongs to, the story of an ordinary person who discovers that a powerful institution is operating according to rules that differ from the ones publicly stated, and who decides, despite everything that decision will cost, to say so. These stories do not always end with justice. Often they do not end at all. They simply stop at some point of institutional resistance or personal cost, and what remains is a record of what one person tried to do and what was done to stop them. Karen Silkwood's case produced real change. The AEC's restructuring was part of it. The legal precedent established in the civil case that nuclear companies could be held liable in state court for contamination caused by their negligence mattered, even though it was later complicated by federal preemption arguments. The public understanding of the risks associated with plutonium processing, which Karen's case forced into national conversation, influenced subsequent regulatory debates about worker safety standards in nuclear facilities. But here is the honest accounting. The specific question Karen was trying to answer, whether falsified quality control records were allowing defective nuclear fuel to be shipped to reactors, was never fully resolved in the public record. The documents she was carrying were never recovered. The people she believed were responsible for falsifying those records were never charged with anything. The chain of custody for what actually happened inside that plant during those years of production was never definitively established in a criminal proceeding. This matters beyond the Silkwood case. It matters because the pattern her case represents, a company producing something hazardous, managing its regulatory disclosures strategically, using the complexity of its own technical processes as a shield against outside scrutiny, and meeting internal whistleblowers with institutional pressure, is not unique to Kerr-McGee in 1974. It is a pattern that recurs. For the generation that watched Walter Cronkite deliver the news and trusted that the institutions of American life were operating in good faith, and then spent the 1970s watching those institutions reveal their private operating principles one by one. Karen Silkwood's story is not a historical curiosity. It is a case study in what happens when the gap between public assurance and private practice is wide enough that one determined person notices and narrow enough that the institution believes it can manage the consequences. What still needs to be answered, more than 5 decades after that white Honda Civic left the road, is simple. What was in those documents? Was the quality control fraud Karen described real? And if so, what did it affect? Who, if anyone, made the decision to ensure those documents did not arrive in Oklahoma City? Institutions do not answer these questions voluntarily. They answer them when the pressure of public attention, legal discovery, or congressional investigation makes silence more costly than disclosure. That pressure, in Karen Silkwood's case, was never sustained long enough. That is not a statement about any one investigation or any one failure. It is an observation about the durability of institutional self-protection when the stakes are high enough. There is a specific kind of silence on that stretch of Highway 74 that has not changed. The road is still there. The flatland is still there on either side. The darkness, after midnight, still presses in from every direction in the way that only exists in places where distance is measured in the time it takes to see another set of headlights. If you drive that road today, you pass the place without knowing it. There is no marker, no memorial, just asphalt and the sound of your own tires and whatever you were thinking about before you got there. Karen Silkwood was 28 years old, and she believed she was carrying something that mattered. She had told Drew Stevens she would be careful. She had called David Burnham and confirmed she was on her way. She had done everything that a person who intends to complete a journey does before beginning it. She had 3 children she loved. She had a sense of humor that coworkers remembered decades later. She could read a technical document and understand what it meant, and she had the particular courage of a person who understands something and refuses to look away from it simply because looking away would be easier. The documents she was carrying have never been found. This fact has been folded into so many theories, so many arguments, so many legal proceedings and journalistic investigations that it sometimes loses the quality it actually possesses. It is simply true. The documents were real. Multiple witnesses confirmed their existence. They left with Karen. They did not arrive. Whatever they contained, they were important enough to carry into the night. They were important enough that someone, Karen Silkwood, believed they were worth the drive, worth the risk, worth everything she had been quietly absorbing for months while continuing to show up to her job and do her work and pay attention. Her father once said, in an interview given many years after her death, that what he wanted people to understand was not the conspiracy or the case or the legal history. What he wanted them to understand was that his daughter was a person who saw something wrong and decided it was her responsibility to do something about it, that this is rare, that it costs something, that it deserved better than what it received. He was right. She drove south on Highway 74. She never arrived. And the question of why, the full, honest, documented answer to that single question, has never been given to the people who deserved it most. She was 28 years old. She was bringing the files, vanished stories, dedicated to the people whose stories were never fully told.